Okay, members. As you know, yesterday evening we had a very good turnout as we heard about OBA and closed that global summit upstairs. Today we're going to take evidence from Dr. Toby Lowe, who's Senior Research Associate at Newcastle University, who has critiqued the OBA approach. He's engaging with us by telephone. And we'll hear him from the far end of the table there. So can I ask you, if you're asking questions or making interventions, that you would introduce yourself? I think he's going to try and watch us on a live stream, but that may not necessarily work out. And because Toby needs away early, we're just going to go straight to that, and then we'll pick up on the rest of the committee business. So the clerk's brief is at page 17. A journal article which Toby has written on the theme of playing the game of outcomes-based performance management is at page 19. And a response to Mark Friedman, which was published online in August, is available at page 40. Now, members, in front of you, you will have PowerPoint slides. They're on your table in hard copy. They're also in your table packs. And I think Toby is going to speak to those as he makes his presentation. So, Dr. Lowe, hopefully you can hear us. It's Mike Nesbitt, the committee chair here. And if you can, thank you very much for making yourself available. And we would welcome you and invite you to make your opening presentation.
Hi, Mike. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Excellent. And I can. I was able to see you a minute ago. Now I'm looking at a picture of myself. Just before I start, do you want to know kind of anything about me and the perspective that I bring to things?
Please, yes.
Yeah. So for the last 2 years, I've worked at Newcastle University Business School as a senior researcher. But for the kind of 15 years prior to that, I was actually working in the public and voluntary sector in England. And I spent the last 8 years of that as a senior manager and then chief executive of a charity in Newcastle in the northeast of England. And so kind of my interest and experience of all this started from the perspective of leading an organisation that was doing work for some of the most vulnerable and disadvantaged folk in the northeast. And it was out of that experience that I had the desire to do some proper research about all this stuff. So I'm going to very quickly run through some of the key ideas that I talk about in my research, responding to this question about how outcomes are used to manage the performance of social interventions. And I believe you've got my slides in front of you, so I'll just kind of take you through those one by one. So moving on to the second slide, I want to talk about what happens when people implement outcomes-based performance management. So that's the acronym that I'm going to use, OBPM, Outcomes-Based Performance Management, and talk about two problems that seem intrinsic whenever people try and implement these approaches. Firstly, there's a measurement problem, and secondly, there's an attribution problem. So moving on to the next slide, we'll deal with the measurement problem first. And that problem is essentially that when people are using outcome-based performance management, they're not actually measuring impact, they're not genuinely measuring outcomes. So when people talk about outcomes, they're not really talking about impact in people's lives, they're talking about what's easily measurable and calling that an outcome. So I'm referring here to the use of proxy measures, which you've probably heard a number of things about over the course of your conference of the last few days. So moving on to the next slide, I'll illustrate with an example about obesity. We all know that obesity is a big social problem, but actually measuring obesity is really difficult because a true measure of body fat is time-consuming and obtrusive to do. So people use a proxy measure for obesity instead, which is BMI, Body Mass Index, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So we can ask the question, what happens when people use BMI as a proxy measure to manage people and organisations? And what happens is things like this story that's illustrated on this slide. So this is a picture of Anita Albrecht. She, at the time, was a 29-year-old personal trainer and bodybuilder and she went to her GP for a checkup. And as part of the checkup, her BMI was measured. And it turns out that she's got a BMI of 29, which is well into the overweight category and only 1 point short of clinically obese. And this is the case because, as we say, BMI isn't a genuine measure of obesity, of body fat. It just takes people's height and divides by their weight. As a result of having a BMI of 29, the nurse that she was seeing told her that she should lose weight and exercise more. So she had to go on a calorie-controlled diet and should exercise more. Advice which was actively dangerous for someone, for a personal trainer and bodybuilder. So what's going on in cases like that is that the person who took Anita's measures, her BMI measure, and this is moving on to the next slide, stopped seeing her as a person with her own rich and complex story. They just saw her as an abstracted measure, as someone with a BMI of 29. So they took this Anita, who has her own rich and complex story, and stopped seeing her, and they only saw the simplified abstracted measure and responded to that. So moving on to the next slide, what we can see in what happens in outcome measurement is it takes people's rich and complex stories, their individual aspects, and tries to shove them into a box of what is measurable. So that's what happens when people use proxy measures as management tools for outcome measurement in this kind of work. And the difference between the proxy measure, what is easily measurable, and impact as it's felt in the lives of people experiencing it, is exactly a measure of how that target distorts the practice of the organisations involved. So that's a very quick run through the measurement problem. And secondly, there's an attribution problem. So moving on to the next slide. And this problem is that outcomes are beyond the control of the organisations which provide support and help to people. So we can illustrate this by looking at how outcomes are created. And firstly, we'll look at how outcome-based performance management thinks they're created. So moving on to the next slide of the program logic model, we can see that this is a very typical representation of how outcomes are created in this kind of outcome-based performance management world. You see it's a linear process that starts with the input resources, then moves to the process of the program, what people are delivering, and moves through to the short and long-term outcomes. So it's essentially a linear model whereby people do work and then change happens. And this linear model is necessary because it shows who is responsible for producing an outcome, so you can hold that organisation accountable for producing those outcomes or not. But the trouble is, moving on to the next slide, that's just not how the world works. The reality of it is shown in the slide, the complex diagram, which this is my favourite diagram in the world. Everyone should have a favourite diagram, right? This is produced by the Government Office for Science, the Government Foresight Unit, in 2007, and it's a systems map of obesity. So this was an amazing piece of work that mapped all the factors that leads to people being obese or not. And so they looked at things like food production and supply, and macroeconomic drivers, and education and media and early life experiences and healthcare treatment options, all the things that you can see represented on that diagram. And what you can see from this diagram is that the factors that lead to someone being obese or not are enormously complex. So if you're working in one bit of this system, say you're working in the healthcare and treatment options, and something changes in some other aspect of the system, something changes in the media or the nature of food production and supply, that's going to affect whether a person is obese or not. And that's entirely out of your control. So moving on to the next slide, the lesson that we take from this is that it is systems that produce outcomes, not particular interventions, not particular organisations, not particular programs. Organisations and programmes contribute to these outcomes, but they cannot be held accountable for producing outcomes, because holding organisations accountable for producing outcomes is impossible. It's simply not possible. So if you try to hold people or organisations accountable for producing outcomes, it's seeking to hold people accountable for things that they don't control. And that is a recipe for failure. Because if you try and hold people accountable for things they don't control, then they learn to manage what they do control, which is the production of data about outcomes. And moving on to the next slide, this is what we see time and again whenever people study what actually happens when people implement outcomes-based performance management approaches. So this is the evidence that people start to produce data about outcomes rather than working on the programs themselves. So moving on to the next slide, to summarise the mass of evidence about this, I've just taken one quote from one of the studies about this. The overall conclusion from an international experience of implementing an outcomes approach is that the journey is long and the results are disappointing. This is from a paper produced by Erica Wimbush in 2011, looking to try and learn the lessons of implementing outcomes approaches in the UK. And what she's talking about, why that journey is long and the results are disappointing, she's talking about people gaming the system. So organisations manipulating their services and the way that their data is recorded so as to focus on producing good-looking data. And this is what the evidence says, that outcome-based performance management turns everyone's job into the production of good-looking data rather than helping the people that are in front of them. And moving on to the next slide, we can see that across any policy area and any country you care to look at where people have implemented outcome-based performance management approaches, they find really, really similar findings. So you can see it in the case of young people in Australian context, in healthcare in the UK context, in employment programs in both the US and UK context, in public services across Europe and the USA, and in education in the USA. Whenever people study this stuff, they find exactly the same kind of stuff happens. People start gaming the system, because that's what you're asking people to do, to produce good-looking data in order to respond to being held accountable for things they don't control. So just finally, moving on to the next slide, what are outcomes good for? Outcomes are really good for helping organisations and partnerships of organisations to talk about purpose together. And this is a really positive thing about the outcomes-based accountability programme, is that it starts with a whole series of conversations about what it is that organisations are trying to achieve, what is it the programmes are trying to achieve. And so these conversations are enormously positive and help to get people pulling in the right direction. So that's a fantastic thing that outcomes are good for. But the trouble is, as soon as you turn those conversations then into performance management metrics and performance manage those organisations off the back of those, as soon as you try and hold people accountable against those metrics, that's when the problems occur. And so you'll see quite frequently, the reports where people have had really positive experience about outcomes-based accountability and other forms of outcome-based performance management, they're in these initial stages where they've had fantastic sets of meetings and fantastic sets of conversations with people that have galvanised a whole set of people around a common purpose. But then when they move later on to the performance management aspect of it, are people going to be resourced or not on the basis of performance against outcome targets? That's when the problems start to occur. And I'll finish there, because I've taken up slightly more time than I thought I was going to do with that.
Toby, thank you very much indeed. That's a comprehensive view. If I could begin perhaps with the Wimbush quote. As you know, we heard from Mark Friedman and Associates yesterday evening, and I think they probably agree with the first half of the Wimbush quote in that the journey is long. Of course, they would disagree with the contention that the results are disappointing. Have you any examples where the results are pleasing?
So the papers that I've seen where the results are pleasing tend to be those written from the perspective of the people who do evaluations within organisations and occasionally the senior managers of organisations. So from their perspective, these kinds of outcomes approaches are brilliant because they produce good-looking data that they can use both internally within all their organisation to help make the case and externally within to help make the case for their organisation. So they provide really good-looking. The papers that have been supportive about this tend to be written from the perspective of evaluator, kind of internal evaluation things. So there's one from written by the Bernardo's evaluation team that says we've had a great experience of implementing an outcomes approach, and there's another I'm thinking of from an American senior civil servant who was tasked with implementing their kind of outcomes approaches, and they tend to say this approach is great because it gives us really good-looking data to work with.
So the temptation is, to use the modern phrase, to game the data. In other words, to choose the data that is most likely to produce the pleasing result from your point of view.
Yeah. And it's not that the people involved necessarily then start doing a terrible job, because there are other really interesting papers. So particularly the SOS paper, the SOS et al. Paper from 2011 that I listed on the breadth of evidence slide, the one after the Wimbush slide. What they did was a series of interviews with people, managers at different levels who are working under a payment by result system, which is kind of outcomes-based performance management taken to its logical conclusion. And they're saying that, yes, the performance management drivers force us to game the system, but we try and do a good job most of the time because that's what our values are. So people's values within these organisations focus them on doing the job that they want to do, but the performance management mechanisms are driving them in different directions. So it creates kind of tensions and difficulties for people, and in some situations their values to do a good job win out, and in other situations, particularly where the performance management is most extreme, so particularly payment by results, and other times when resources are on the line, that's when the gaming of the system kicks in hardest.
You also suggest that to an extent outcomes-based accountability is attempting to do the impossible by holding organisations accountable for producing outcomes which are beyond their control. But to look at it from the other perspective, Toby, I mean, surely that is life. There's no organisation which has full control over their environment. And you accept, for example, the Minister for Health cannot be held solely responsible for tackling obesity. And the whole idea of outcomes-based accountability is that you have a cross-cutting approach where the Minister for Health is supported by the Minister for Education and by other government and non-government organisations who have roles to play in tackling obesity. Indeed,
and it's interesting that the outcomes-based accountability approach evolved this kind of concept of shared and collective accountability. But then how does that work when it's translated to a commissioning level, for example? So the price of it becoming more coherent in terms of reflecting the way that the world actually works is it finds it more difficult to operate as a performance management model, because if it's not a mechanism to hold organisations accountable. So I had an extended conversation with David Burnby, who's one of the UK people who implement and train people to use outcome-based accountability approaches. And he was saying that what we do is we take a collective notion of responsibility, but in the end, he was saying that you use these notions of outcomes data, the metrics of how organisations are performing, to say whether they should be commissioned or not. And so at some point, this collective responsibility collapses down into should we commission this organisation or not? And if you're using the outcomes-based accountability approach, you're commissioning on the basis of holding people accountable for things they don't control. So you're trying to say, if you're commissioning, say, an anti-obesity community-level health service, and you're saying, yes, you should get your contract renewed because obesity amongst your target population has come down 15%, which is the kind of things that a 15% against baseline is just the kind of things that an outcome-based accountability approach says, then actually you're rewarding them for things that are substantially beyond their control. Because, as we've seen, it's actually the media plays a significant role. The way that food production and supply works plays a significant role. The way that the education system works plays a significant role.
Okay. Toby, I'd like to introduce a couple of my colleagues, beginning with Christopher Stolford.
Good afternoon. In terms of the example that you gave, body mass index, is that really comparable with a measure, for example, such as reducing the number of stillbirths or the instances of illiteracy within society? I understand that the general point you're trying to make in terms of BMI being an arbitrary figure on a page, but in terms of outcomes other than those that could be described in that way, is that really a good example to be giving?
So the where I focus most is on the kind of the complex social problems. So things like obesity, or things like tackling programs to tackle severe and multiple disadvantage, homelessness, substance misuse, mental health problems. Those kind of things is where I've looked at most. For measures like stillbirth, then if you want to reduce the number of children who are stillborn, then you're absolutely correct in that's not a proxy measure. That's exactly what you want to address, so that in that situation the measurement problem is reduced, but you've still got the attribution problem in relation to all of that.
Is it possible that, in terms of, just following on from that, in terms of dealing with sort of complex social issues, if the government identified more basic, the building blocks of a social problem, as it were, the more basic measures, and focused their action there, then does it follow through in terms of having an impact, even though it may not be a direct one, it's an indirect one, on the more complex social issues?
So the question there is, what's the relationship between the things that are being measured and how impact is felt in the lives of the people that are receiving the various services and that are involved? Now, and again, there's some really interesting Australian evidence that was just published earlier this year, where they did a kind of comprehensive meta-study on all the outcomes-based programs that they've tried. And what they found is that in the things that were being measured in a particular program, the indicators improved. Now, we need to have the caveat of that, of why did the indicators improve? Is that a genuine improvement, or is that people just working the data, gaming the system? And it's kind of not possible to know the answer to that question. But let's say for a minute, let's assume for the sake of argument that the indicators were genuine in that. So the things that were being measured improved. But what they found was then all the other aspects of that problem got worse. So there's that natural tendency to what measures is what matters, and you can't measure everything that matters.
In terms of that brings me on to the next point I was going to ask about data manipulation. If you're saying that in an OBA scenario, data manipulation is a major problem. Is that not going to be an endemic problem in any system of measuring government performance rather than simply an OBA system?
I don't know if you're familiar with Campbell's Law. So it was produced by an American professor in 1976 called Donald Campbell, who wrote a very famous essay called Assessing the Impact of Planned Social Change. And in that essay, he formulated what has become known as Campbell's Law, which says, the more any quantitative social indicator is used for the purposes of social decision-making, the more that indicator will tend to corrupt and distort the processes it is intended to monitor. And so this was actually going to be my final slide about this stuff. So it's really easy to interpret that as saying, no, people shouldn't measure stuff. Actually, what it's saying is that people need to ask questions about the purpose of measurement. So when people measure to make themselves accountable to others, that introduces gaming drivers into that system. But if people measure to learn and improve in relation to their practice, A, they will know the things to measure. B, they'll know the limitations of the data that are being produced. We measured this, we called it a 3, it could have been a 4, it could have been a 2, you know, it was quite on the borderline. And so they understand the limitations of that data. And C, they are able to interpret that data effectively and use it for learning and improvement purposes.
By saying that, are you making an argument for an independent measure? So, for example, I mean, that's why one of the reasons why we have the Office of National Statistics is to provide an independent measure of information free from possible government corruption. I don't mean government corruption in the sense of personnel, I mean in the sense of manipulation.
It's really important to have that kind of independent statistical stuff, particularly at top level, because it provides important information about for policymakers on what the key problems are and how to prioritise resources at that kind of top level. So that kind of, in OBA language, population level information is really, really important for policymakers to make good decisions. But the question from a performance management mechanism is, performance management perspective rather, is how do you help people get better at their practice? And the measurement aspect of that isn't about national measures and kind of independent statistics. It's about enabling those people to measure what's important for them and creating the conditions under which they can be honest with one another about their performance. So there's this idea called positive error cultures, right? Which is how an organisation or a sector responds to mistakes and uncertainties. So, an organisation has a positive error culture if, when someone makes a mistake or is uncertain about what they do, they are able to and empowered, and the culture supports them saying, do you know what, I got that wrong. And in organisations like that, performance improves massively because people are able to use those mistakes and uncertainties as opportunities for learning and improvement. But outcome-based performance management works exactly in the opposite direction, because it says to people, only report your successes.
Yeah. In terms of the diagram that you presented regarding the sort of the vast myriad of things that influence obesity, I mean, looking at that diagram, there is such a vast range of influences there. It almost would appear as though ultimately, in terms of tackling that one particular issue, you would almost think that government can have virtually no impact by direct intervention. Is that your view?
No. But exactly, there is the danger of presenting these kind of diagrams is people are potentially paralysed by that level of complexity. But in the end, that diagram is just a representation of what life is like. Mm-hmm. Right? That's the real world. if we simplify it to make the task seem easier, we're essentially trying to fool ourselves. That it is possible for governments to make an intervention in all sorts of these areas. So if you look at the range of kind of summary themes that it produces that are on that diagram: healthcare and treatment, early life experiences, food production and supply, media, education, macroeconomic drivers. These are all things that the government influences. And what it says is that an obesity strategy needs to have all of those things as part of it. And the other thing I would say about this is that when you're working on the ground on these kind of issues, you have a natural instinct for the complexity of this stuff. Because if you're trying to doing a community intervention that tries to support real people with changing their eating and exercise and other aspects of their lifestyle to try and tackle obesity, you know the range of things that are impacting on their lives because you have a relationship with them and you begin to understand an aspect of who they are. So you know that you're making a contribution to a broader system change. But if we give the people who are doing that, doing those roles, freedom to use their judgment effectively about how to intervene in that complex system, they can deal with that complexity.
Although ultimately, that's what you've just said. Is that not entirely compatible with an OBA approach in allowing for the setting of targets and the direction of government resource and influence to try and tackle the various myriad factors, but ultimately lead to an outcome at the end of a particular period of time?
The challenge with using OBA in that context is that, as I understand the process, what happens is that initially an overall outcome like tackling obesity is translated through a series of conversations into a set of particular metrics and targets related to baselines in particular areas. So that the overall sense of purpose of we need to tackle obesity is then translated into a very fixed set of metrics about what tackling that means. And the translation from the overall sense of purpose down to this is a fixed set of metrics is what prevents the workers on the front line from being able to use their relationship with the people with whom they work to say, okay, in your case, Mrs. Jones,
Can I just interrupt you there?
Yeah.
It may prevent that, but does it ultimately prevent the target from being reached?
Well, it acts against it because it encourages the worker to only do the things that meet the metric, not to do what is necessary to actually tackle obesity.
Thank you.
If there are things that need to happen that are outside that metric, they won't get done.
Okay, Toby, Christopher is finished. The next voice you're going to hear is the committee vice chairman, Danny Kennedy.
Good afternoon, Toby. He made me sound like Chris Tarrant there. Thanks very much indeed. Thanks for your presentation. And a couple of quick points. We invariably, like others, are now find ourselves in a situation where various programmes of government and government agencies keep on pouring vast sums of money into various issues to try and get a different outcome without success, right? So having spent those vast sums without the hoped result, then we kind of we're looking closely at, and obviously the executive has decided to proceed with a programme for government based on outcome based. What's your alternative, or what? I mean, are you content with the status quo that we still hammer away at and flog what might be described politely as dead horses?
No, I don't. I have to say that I don't know the detail of how different branches of your executive do your performance management thing, but what the status quo is very unlikely to help. In that, I mean, I don't know how much. Are you familiar with the ideas of kind of new public management? Is that a term that
broadly,
makes
yes.
sense? Yeah.
Yes.
So,
But just to explain, I mean, our system is principally, I mean, it's not designed, but it's fallen into a silo approach where the departments are they gain individually their monies and allocate them almost without reference to other colleagues and other departments. And that's a very broad sweeping statement, but that's pretty much one of the criticisms of it.
So one of the things I was going to say was that systems approaches are part of the important changes that help to tackle that kind of cycle of failure that you've been talking about. So things which enable organisations, whether those are delivery organisations or whether those are government departments, to understand their interrelationships around kind of, for example, questions about obesity are the starting point for change around this. So that can mean kind of pooled budgets for particular areas to tackle particular problems, and it means creating the effective systems infrastructure so that people can have the effective conversations, so they can use the evidence about what's going on. Because like I said, at a population level, it is important to measure and understand what's happening so that you can understand what the different problems are. If you take these systems approaches and create the ability to have conversations between organisations to prioritise and to work together effectively to tackle problems, that seems to me to be the approach worth taking. And that there are a number of organisations who are now supporting particular areas to adopt these kind of systems change approaches. So
Yeah.
that's the route that I would suggest going down.
And quickly, if I may, Chairman, your criticism of outcomes-based appears largely not on the gathering of data, because every government, every department will gather data, probably too much data, but it is the application of the data is your criticism. Am I correct?
Exactly so. So it's the use of that data for target-based performance management, basically, and that's what's been shown repeatedly to fail.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem.
Okay, Mike Nesbitt again. Here, Toby. One more member to hear from, and that's Cathal Boylan.
Thank you very much, and thank you for presenting to the committee, Toby. Toby, you have to agree that even some of the comments you made so far, would it be fair to say that if you get your baseline or your starting point right, you'll achieve outcomes?
Sorry, could you say that again, please, Cal?
If you get your baseline or your starting point right, you'll achieve an outcome, yeah?
Do you mean in terms of measuring the...
Yeah, I mean, because all we've heard about, even last night, was we heard about data collection and information, and we've heard the previous manager, Mr. Kennedy, talk about the amount of data that governments do collect. So, I mean, what my point is this here: if you get your starting point right, will you not achieve the outcome? No.
No, I don't think so, because that kind of assumes that there's a linear change between there's a linear transition between your starting point and the change that you're trying to adopt. So, this idea of the use of baselines is one of the things that outcomes-based accountability, as I understand it, pushes quite hard. And on the face of it, it's a very kind of sensible thing to do, because if you want to measure the difference you're making, you need to understand where you've started, right? But the nature of complex systems, the nature of how the world works, is that if anything else changes in that system between you measuring your baseline and now, then your baseline isn't worth anything, basically. So think about if you're trying to run employment programs, right, employability programs, and you measure your baseline before the economic crash in 2009, right? How much use is a pre-crash baseline to you when understanding your performance in 2010? None at all. Similarly, with things like external shocks to the system, like Brexit, right? If something happens like that between your baseline measurement and your achievement of your outcome, that completely throws out all the measures in ways that you can't even that are unpredictable. So you won't. It's impossible to know how something like Brexit will affect those particular baselines and change.
Quite interesting. It's a pity you weren't sitting in front of us, you know, but I understand you can't be here. But surely to God, there's models out there, best practice models out there that we can learn from in terms of introducing a baseline or measurement.
Well, that's the thing. I'm intrinsically suspicious of best practice models because what that's saying is that a model that's worked in one place can just be transplanted, and kind of plonked into a new context, and it will work in exactly the same way. But that's not how the world works, is it? The context in which something operates is massively important to how and whether that thing works. And it's not. This isn't a technical question about measurement. It's not possible to adjust for the effects of complexity on how baselines and whatever work, because any external change to that complex system will throw out those baselines in ways that you can't adjust the baselines for. And that's kind of my frustration with these kind of models based on baseline measurement, in that there's an entire complexity science, as in these are the physicists, these are the biologists, these are hard science people, these are people who know and understand these measurement processes better than anyone else. There's an entire complexity science which says exactly this, that you can't use those baselines effectively. And in the kind of social science world, in the social policy world, we don't seem to have learned those kind of lessons yet.
Okay, no, I appreciate it. And like I said, it's a pity you weren't here to have a good debate, because you've given us food for thought. But just a final point, because I mean, it's all right. We're talking about data and everything else, but ultimately what we're talking about is making lives better for people and conditions, everything else. You've used examples previous to that. There's only one other point I'd want to put to is, I would have thought in terms of, especially over here where we are heavily reliant on public sector, I would have thought it would have been appropriate that this type of model would have worked within the public sector because of accountability. Now, you may have a different view on that, or maybe have experience in some other jurisdictions in relation to that.
Exactly, the attraction of outcome-based performance management is that it seems to give that kind of accountability. So it's built into the name of outcomes-based accountability, but people say exactly the same thing about payment by results and other forms of the way this is implemented. But in the end, that sense of accountability, I don't think is real. In that, what I experienced when I was a chief executive in this situation was that it actually created a situation in which no one was telling each other the truth, because people, and this is where it kind of matches, my experience matches the evidence out there, that if you create a situation in which you only reward success, people only talk about success, and therefore you don't get genuine accountability at all. You get an entire discourse based on people pretending that what is happening is good. Genuine accountability, I think, comes from creating these positive error cultures where people talk about what's gone wrong in their work. And that it feels to me like the task of trying to create effective government, how do we help people do their jobs better by genuinely talking with one another about how their practice works, and as you say, the impacts that they're making on people's lives.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Toby, Mike Nesbitt one last time. I suppose what we need to do as a committee is make sure we know what to look out for, because our role is to assist ministers in their role, and so we need to be able to scrutinise effectively. So just to go back to the Campbell's Law that I was unaware of, and the dangers of OBA, is it the equivalent of watching out for when people stop teaching children to give them a rounded education and start teaching children so that they will pass tests?
That's exactly one of the 4 types of gaming that occurs in these kind of situations. So exactly looking out for that kind of situation, it would be a really great way of enabling scrutiny of this kind of stuff. And if you kind of want a suggestion for how that scrutiny you could generalise that kind of scrutiny, whistleblowing cultures are really, really important in this kind of context. So, do you remember the case of Mid Staffordshire Hospital and the famous quote from the report that said it was hitting all its targets but killing all its patients? What the problem there was that they had no whistleblowing culture and no mechanism for people who were the workers on the front line who were raising concerns about the impact of these targets on their practice. There was no place for those voices to be heard, because when they took them to higher management said, no, we can't hear this because that will affect our performance ratings, right? So enabling the workers at the front line to have a mechanism to report instances in which those performance management mechanisms are negatively impacting on their judgment, that would be a way to hold this process to scrutiny.
Toby, that's very useful, and can I thank you very much indeed for making yourself available to the committee today. We appreciate your time and your input.
You're highly welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Safe journeys. Thank you. Members, should we advise the other statutories of yesterday and today in terms of the sessions and just direct them to Hansard if they are interested? Yep. Okay. Apologies. Stuart Dixon is an apology. Philip Logan is still just finishing his study leave trip with the clerk, Cathy O'Hanlon and others, and we welcome Trevor Allen for today, one day only. Any other apologies? Okay. Members, a couple of points. First of all, there's an event you may be interested in on Monday the 17th in the Long Gallery. It is the panel of experts in redress, and they are publishing a report, Historical Institutional Abuse, Cost Analysis of Proposed Compensation Scheme. So that's the 17th in the Long Gallery at 12 noon. The panel of experts in redress, of course, briefed us towards the end of last month on a couple of reports detailing what survivors want from redress and also on their framework for compensation. Could you respond directly to the organisers if you wish to go, please? I received correspondence from a representative of the organisation Birth Mothers and Their Children for Justice. There was a request to meet me regarding mother and baby homes, and that is that the organisation is represented on the panel of experts on redress. Members, I'm just wondering whether we should advise the group. The committee has written to the Department of Health to ask for information on the scoping exercise that they have been asked to undertake with regard to mother and baby homes. Content with that approach in the meantime?
Great.
Thank you. Just a reminder, next lunch with the House of Lords EU Committee is on Monday at 1 p.m. in the members' dining room. And the current list of committee invitations is at page 6 of your main pack. In the absence of any comment on that, We'll go on to the draft minutes, starting at page 8 of our last meeting. That was not last night's, but the 5th of October. And I ask members, are you content to agree the draft minutes of the 5th of October?
Agreed.
Thank you. The list of outstanding committee correspondence begins at page 14 of the meeting pack. It lists responses from the Executive Office which remain outstanding or for which further information is still required. And I think it would be fair to say, members, the list is growing. And this was a problem that beset us in the last mandate. Note. Correspondence, the summary sheet begins at page 47 of your meeting pack. The latest Delivering Social Change stakeholder update is at page 48. Are members agreeable that we circulate to other relevant statutory committees for their information?
Agreed.
Also, members, correspondence from Clarawood Community Association. Now, this is at page 67 of your pack. This is regarding a complaint of theirs about aspects of the administration of the Social Investment Fund. What I would propose, as it's quite a long and complex list of correspondence, members, that in the first instance, could I suggest we forward to the department for comment and request information with regard to the appeals or complaints mechanism that they have in place for the Social Investment Fund. Yes? Members, is it time to request a briefing on the workings of the Social Investment Fund?
Where is it at in terms of, I mean, I think we're not nearly at the point where all of the projects are going.
Well, you're raising a question which would suggest we should be
Fair enough.
asking the department.
But sometimes we get updates from the ministers in the chamber, Chair, on it. Or the junior minister. It's on a regular basis.
Well, we have said we want to be the most effective statutory committee based primarily on scrutiny.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Okay.
I tell you what, we'll split the difference. Will we ask for a written briefing and then we can make a decision on whether we want
Yeah.
formal briefing, because if Christopher's right and most of it is allocated, maybe.
Well, the sooner the better. The reason I say this, the sooner the better, because I was hoping to move my constituency office, or like open my constituency office from what was Michael's constituency office in Sandy Row, and because the building belonged to his brother Chris, the rent people would only pay half the rent, but it's part of a SIF project, and we're in the process of basically new people taking ownership of the building. So the sooner they take ownership of it, the better, because then I can get my constituency office open.
Is that a convoluted declaration of interest?
I get involved in a number of parties.
Yes, well, the sooner it's open, the thing's sorted.
Right, members. Correspondence has been received from the Northern Ireland Retired Police Officers Association. Now, this is at page 85 of your main pack. They want to raise a concern that provision has not been made for the Northern Ireland Public Services Ombudsman to investigate allegations or maladministration or any other form of complaint which might be made against the Police Ombudsman of Northern Ireland. Now, I would declare that I have also been approached in my party political and MLA capacity with regard to this issue. And as you know, it was the Legacy Committee in the last mandate who, as a committee, passed the legislation creating NIPSO. And again, to declare, with my individual and party political hat on, I questioned whether it was right that an ombudsman should be capable of being referred to another ombudsman. So, in the absence of any other suggestion, what I was going to recommend to the committee is that we ask Assembly Research to see if they can find any examples, not just locally, where an ombudsman's office can be referred to another ombudsman. And secondly, just to take a look at exactly what is in place in terms of options for anybody who is unhappy with the police ombudsman and any report or recommendation or ruling that the ombudsman may come to. For example, is there recourse to the Minister for Justice. Obviously, you can do a judicial review, but that involves cost as well as time. So basically what I'm saying is a couple of points of research as our starting point.
Okay, yeah.
And we will revert to the Retired Police Officers Association with that information.
Great.
Okay,
That's fine.
thank you. Any other correspondence any member wishes to raise? No? Okay. Draft forward work programme.
Just on that, I mean, because we had a good presentation last night and obviously today, although I prefer people to be sitting in front of us, but that wasn't. But it's give us food for thought, and we're getting a better understanding of it. I mean, what's our next plans? I mean, that's. I think it's a wider discussion. I'd like to have a wee bit more discussion on it. I mean,
Okay.
in terms of the process. I mean, if you'd like to, I know what the plans were. Is there any suggestion what way we could take it forward?
I think
And Mr. Lowe had some interesting points today, but I would like to have time to put more questions in relation.
Yeah, and
Not to say that Mr. Lowe will be invited back, but
no.
I think just as a committee, I would like some more discussion. Maybe.
And
Is there any other avenues we can take in terms of?
I think
in terms of looking at how it works,
Yeah,
the broad
yeah.
principles of it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, he's given us some examples there in his PowerPoint presentation from Australia and this, that, and the other. Maybe we should ask Assembly Research again. They could summarise. Karen, do you want to jump in here?
So there was some research that Assembly Research has done for us about where the outcomes-based accountability approach has been used in other jurisdictions. So that was it was in the papers for last night's meeting. We just didn't want to reproduce everything, and they also produced a paper on scrutiny of outcomes, mostly based on the Scottish model, which is slightly different, I think, to what is being proposed. So is there a particular piece of research
Well,
you'd like to
as
explore,
was
or-
listening to there's some very interesting points and questions made there. I mean, but obviously from an academic point of view, the response we're getting, I just would have liked to have an opportunity to tease it out more, especially because we got a good presentation last night as well.
Yeah.
We spent an hour and a half, but I mean, it's
What I would say, Cal, is that the draft programme for government is due very soon. I mean, if it was published today, an 8-week consultation takes us to the end of the first week of December, I think, something like the 7th or 8th. So it's getting very tight to complete the deadlines of having the thing actually published with the other documents, budget and the rest, by the end of the year. So if we take it in good faith, the document will be out within the next week. Maybe with that evidence base, we then say, right, well, here are the issues. We want to know how we scrutinise this. How do we check out on that?
I think, I mean, ultimately, I think that's right, Chair, but I think as well, ultimately, government is adopting this approach.
oh no, 100%.
Yeah, but I think-
and it's not even.
It's how we scrutinize it, how we
it's not even
assist and
case of
advise.
plans, and that's not even. But I mean, it was quite interesting debate today. I would like to, Mr. Lowe here,
I mean,
see what he had to say.
sort of diagrams and what have you. I do think that the whole question of, I think the example of obesity
Yeah, I know.
took you off in a different direction from something that is actually, you know, because it is BMI of a certain level. I thought that was an example that it's not necessarily
Wasn't it?
fitting.
Certainly
you know.
wasn't a good example to use, but
You know, that Campbell's law, which I was unaware of, it said the more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures. Of course it will. Human nature.
That's right.
That's the measure. I'm being paid to deliver a target. Of course you're going to be tempted to, as he would put it, game the data. But I would suggest until we see the programme for government,
Okay,
which we should see by this time next week.
But I actually think, you see that in terms, you're absolutely right about the inherent risk of sort of people trying to manipulate the data. What I think actually that makes the case for was the case that the folks yesterday were talking about, which was simple targets. And they can't really be manipulated if you, in the same way as something that's maybe measured in percentage terms or stuff like that can be. So if you're actually keeping it simple, it's easier to measure the outcomes.
smart targets. Yeah.
And being totally open and transparent with all the data.
Yeah.
Yes.
Here's what we said we were going to do. Here's what we've done.
Very much.
And if we haven't got it right, tell us how to do it better.
Very much so.
Okay. Yeah, happy enough.
Yeah,
We'll
no,
return.
fine, that's
We'll
fine, yeah.
put it on the agenda for next
Yeah,
week.
okay.
And hopefully we'll have that document by then. So anything else on the draft forward work programme, members, which is at page 90? In the absence of that, any other business? And I suggest we adjourn until Wednesday the 19th, 2 p.m. here in room 30. Thank you very much.
Committee room 30.